Hey everyone, and welcome back to Stats Chat. Today saw the end of the NRG TTS League. We finally got our last two games in, which had been a little bit delayed, and that means that we've locked in our final standings and we can really start to pick apart and deconstruct those results. I'm not going to go right into all of them today. We're just going to continue with our weekly kind of look at what the meta state looks like. But there will be some articles on the guild website and also some videos, hopefully between me and myself and Mickey, who I work with at Song of Ice and Fire Stats, where we deconstruct all the kind of win rates. We start to look at something that we've started to try and coin called impact, where we look at how influential certain game pieces, commanders and units are on the game right now. What kind of things you should be considering the most when you build your lists, and what is really defining the meta is effectively what we're looking to kind of build a formula for, because it is not an exact science, that's for sure. But my congratulations goes to Ariakas, who managed to take a victory over Stannis Thousandth Lord Commander in the final game. He took the win. We also just today saw Brett Lampfer manage to secure second place with a win over So Cisgender. Two really good streams there, particularly the last stream from Brett versus So Cisgender, a really close game that could have gone either way right up into the last round. Very interesting to see the Starks come close to losing that game, but still having all the tools they need to pull it out at the end. We end up with a Stark winner. We end up with a Stark in second. We end up with a Stark in third. We see Stannis with his Baratheons coming in fourth. And then we get ourselves two more Starks at 5 and 6. And our 7th place finisher is Free Folk. This rounds out all the players who were unbeaten or had a single loss. Unfortunately, for the meta state, there isn't a lot of variety in there. We're seeing a single Baratheon do well, a single Free Folk player do well, and 5 Starks. There is some variety in the commanders used by the Starks, but really we're talking about Robb, Howland, and really a token choice of other commanders. We see a lot of Stark mirrors played through Howland, and we see Robb dominate most matchups that aren't against Starks. In general, it's easy to make sweeping statements and say Starks are overpowered. It is starting to become a bit of a trend when we look at the results from Masters of Westeros. They too looked very similar to this. I think they had 7 of the top 10 were Stark players at that 100-player tournament. We, of course, have to look at the win rates overall. We have to look at what is specifically happening and why this is occurring. But I would say that actually it's not a case that Starks are overpowered. It's that there are some very specific lists that the Starks can produce which are incredibly high win rates. I'm talking, of course, about Stark lists that have 9 and 10 activations. We've seen, and Mickey has broken down the stats for a Stark list which has 10 activations and plays into anything but another Stark list with 10 activations, wins over 75% of the time. That is way outside of what a Song of Ice and Fire Stats and I consider acceptable game balance. And these aren't small numbers of outlier results. We're actually talking about really high numbers of play, really large amounts of games for a single tournament. We're seeing this same list repeatedly appear. And for me, I think that that's what we have to discuss. We can't talk about Starks in general because there is not a lot wrong with Starks in general. It's a very specific list, and more importantly, the impact that that list is having on everybody else and the way they build. I'll talk about that a little bit more later, because today I am actually going to try and concentrate on what is balanced, what I would like balance to be, and kind of give you some examples of where things are going right, because I have focused and do focus a lot on where the imbalances are, both as a way for players to kind of try and gain tactical advantages, because of course being able to identify the imbalances, understand them, and use them to your advantage is one of the major parts of being a good competitive player. So where has that left our faction power rankings after the TTS event? There are, of course, some other TTS events. Some have already started, some are about to get going. They all feed into this same power rankings. This is never will and never has been defined by a single event. That's why, despite the fact that Free Folk have generally not performed that well, even though they had that single player up in the top 7, even though they have not performed that well this tournament, they are still in second place, because it is just one piece of the puzzle of how well they are doing in general. But the meta is currently quite stable. We see the Starks actually lose a small amount of ranking this week. They were starting to pull away from the pack, but they're not, as a whole, as a faction, that significantly above the others. Like I say, there are some specific list builds which seem to be what give them their real tournament advantage. But the Free Folk are still right behind them. The Lannisters are pretty stable. The Night's Watch have gained some points this week, but not enough to really look like they're going to overtake the Lannisters anytime soon. Baratheons have had another nice little bounce back after a very bad week last week. They have managed to overtake the neutrals by just a few points. The Baratheons have found themselves up there in the final of the TTS event. I do think that they have some competitive builds, and most important, actually, looking forward, is that they have some really good tools to marginalize direwolves, to constrict them. But I think that players are still settling on a competitive list for them, settling on where they're good, and there is a lack of experience in the faction in general at this competitive level, which means that they just fall down at the last hurdle. You don't quite get the 6 wins, you get 5 wins, whereas you might have placed with a 4 and 2 rating and been up there in 8th, 9th place. You instead get 3 and 3 and end up kind of middle of the pack. So it's just those little things that are going to get the Baratheons up into the top tier. Will they make it? Only time will tell. Also, Champions of the Stag and some other things that have been spoiled could help them in the future. Neutrals, I still find tough to really give a fair shout, because they have so few options by comparison to the other armies. The Stormcrow Dervishes will really give them another possible, I do say it's possible, list build option as a Stormcrow, Dario Naharis kind of led force, but because until now they have effectively been entirely a Bolton kind of army build, which means that they really are playing with even less options than the Targaryens. But the Targaryens themselves are still dead in last. No movement there. I don't see them getting any better, even with that Targ Heroes one. So we focused on some game imbalances. And interestingly enough, when we talk about the Stark imbalances, they are, to me, in a very specific list build, as I've mentioned. I've spoken to a number of, shall we call them die-hard Stark players about the where their faction is now and what it really means for the rest of the meta. And interestingly, often they respond with, if they are willing to accept that their faction that they love is very good and outperforming other factions, then their normal response is that they believe that Starks are currently effectively what every faction should be at. and that Starks don't need to be brought down to everybody else's level, but that everybody else needs to be brought up to Starks level in terms of kind of the list building options they have and things like that. I actually would say that that is very much wrong, because the Starks are only doing very, very well with a very specific set of builds, and also a very specific set of builds that Starks can produce to counter their own builds. That's the really most unfortunate part about the about this meta right now, is that the best counter to Starks is Howland in Starks. But if we're looking for a really good set of balance, I think that the current best faction for that is the Night's Watch. The Night's Watch have a near perfectly 50% win ratio at 50.45. Their ELO rating of 15.8 is just above that zero, just above completely balanced. This has gone up in the past week, but really it's absolutely where it should be. We cannot expect anything better than that. That's, like, as you can see, like with a +9, that's a week on week variation just in terms of the exact number of submissions and whether or not you've won 4 out of 7 or 3 out of 7 that week. They have a decent amount of games played, and what we really see is we see a relatively acceptable win rate against all opposing factions. Starks, who are outperforming them, they are only getting a 46.6% win rate. But that's not a bad win rate at all. You know, that's acceptably balanced. The cause for concern is the 63% win rate that they achieve against Targaryens. But of course, that isn't at all, in my mind, a Night's Watch problem. That's a Baratheon problem. Targaryen problem. Targaryens are posting that kind of win rate against everybody. So again, we're saying that's not anything to do with the Night's Watch. The Night's Watch are fine. Their only issues for balance for me right now are that they are performing very, very badly in Dark Wings, Dark Words, and Winds of Winter. They seem unable to kind of have the full set of options that do well into the secret missions, which is interesting because other than generally having a slightly higher points cost than a lot of other players, they're And yes, there's no very specific unit combinations or NCUs who play very, very well into this game mode. There doesn't seem to me to be any particular reason why they can't perform in these game modes, except possibly that it favors an NCU commander, but their NCU commander Othel doesn't favor this game. Why particularly they do so badly, I can't put my finger on it, but they are repeatedly coming into the NRG event. They had a abysmal Dark Winds, Dark Words win rate, most of which was defined. Most Dark Winds, Dark Words submissions have come from the Masters of Westeros tournament in Paris, which were, after the event, all the submissions were uploaded to the site. So all of that historical data is included in all these power rankings. Everything that we've ever talked about is influenced by that 100-player physical tournament, the last big event run before COVID-19. And now in the NRG event, they mirrored that same bad win ratio. They won exactly 25% of their games in Dark Wings, Dark Words, and that's really capped them from being able to get those top finishing positions. Our top performing commander this week is Alistair. He has appeared both as our previous top performer in our top 5 performing commanders in previous weeks and our lowest 5 performing commanders in previous weeks. He seems to struggle to really define himself in one particular place, and yet provides a very varied toolkit, a very powerful toolkit, depending on the matchup, I guess, and depending on really the game that he's playing into. I think when used very well, Alistair can really provide a lot of strength. But he's not like a straightforward, just he obviously goes in this unit and he obviously does well in this game mode. What is most interesting is that he seems to be posting a very bad win rate against Starks. Othel seems to be the one choice that the Night's Watch can make against Starks. But outside of that, he's doing very well. Interestingly, in the NRG TTS event, for players that have all appeared in the top 5, the top half, we see Alistair appear in a range of different units. We see him in Ranger Hunters, we see him in Swarm Brothers, and we see him in Builder Crossbowmen. His varied toolkit that he improves both combat abilities and ranged abilities all have strength, and his cards can actually really provide very high impact and are not necessarily as predictable as a lot of the rest of the Night's Watch deck. He doesn't bring vows himself, he brings instantaneous effects, which means that he doesn't conflict with the rest of the Night's Watch deck particularly. So I guess that's why he can at times be very, very strong. But he is not just winning repeatedly. So I think that he is in a good place, and personally I like to see him in those crossbowmen. I think he can really dominate the battlefield, but I also see a ton of value when he is placed into those Ranger Hunters. It just requires very careful use of that unit. So that, in a lot of ways, is basically the kind of balance that I'm hoping and looking to see in the future from a lot of these factions. It is, of course, always very difficult, particularly with the long time between updates and between kind of chances to rebalance the game when it's a physical game, the way any war game is. That's what we're hoping every faction can kind of balance themselves around, what level we can see them sitting at. We want to see a good use of lots of different commanders. We want to see no particular commander outperforming all the rest inside of a faction. We want to see a varied set of lists, and really we want to see the game go down to gameplay rather than conforming to a particular meta and really building everything you have around beating specific lists or being a specific list style. So I guess we'll just end by reminding everybody that there are still many tournaments going on, lots of new events coming along. Just now, the newest event is a tournament being run out of, it's a TTS event, but it's effectively being run out of a store in the UK called Boards and Swords. Store that I've personally been down to play a physical event at, and really has a great community. So if you're able to enter that, then that would be really great. I know that they will love the support during this time, and you can help to grow a real local community as well as just entering an online TTS event. It does have a UK focus, so if you're in the UK, then really definitely you should support that and sign up to that, help build up the UK scene. But it is, of course, open to everybody. There are many other events going on now that the NRG TTS League is closed, and of course Assault on River Run is now into its second week, an event that I'm part of, so I will be paying close attention to that obviously over the next few weeks, talking about how that might be affecting the meta. The important takeaway from that being, not only do we see Kickstarter exclusives, therefore the Mountain That Rides, really affecting the popularity of Lannisters, but we even see the the cards that were spoilt in the Simon Expo that have both a points cost and rules. So effectively, we see the Clegane Butcher, we see the Mormont Captain, I believe, and I'm sure there's another unit in there. But yeah, these are really, really new units. There are a sprinkling of them used throughout the tournament. We'll see if they kind of pop up as having really high, low, or interesting win rates. But yeah, we'll see mostly I think what we will see is how important Mountain That Rides has been on that meta, and whether or not he is able to make the Lannisters have a realistic shot at winning. He has massively increased their usage, massively increased the number of Lannister entries, so that de facto means that the Lannisters have a much better chance of winning. But will he actually improve their win rate, or is it more of a mental thing that people like to include him, people want to have him, want to have those list building options? So yeah, keep up with all of the guild content. There will be lots of new videos going up every week, and new articles coming out. I know we're currently working on something to do a discussion piece around the tactics board, looking at the 3 NCUs versus 2 NCU meta. You can check out next week's Small Council Radio, where we will be giving a whole breakdown of the NRG TTS event. We'll be looking at all those statistics we talked about at the start in terms of pick rates of units and whether or not they really resulted in high win rates. We saw some things again and again and again, and we'll see whether or not they are having the kind of impact that people clearly think that they should have, because otherwise we wouldn't see them all the time. So until next week,